it's really similar.
Oh, hi there. I'm standing in a giant pit, and I'm super excited about it. We are here right now in Truro in the agricultural campus, which is one of the best places to show you about soils. So come on in. So this pit was a fantastic collaborative effort between our two campuses and the Department of Lands and Forestry. So this pit was dug specifically for you guys so that we can show you the story of what has happened here. So if you look at the soil horizon over here, there's a wonderful story to tell. And we're lucky enough to have Kevin Keys, Dr. Kevin Keys from the Department of Lands and Forestry to narrate this exciting story for us.
The soil profile, deeper than most that I've seen. It's nice to be able to walk into a pit that's dug by a backhoe and not a shovel. There's lots of interesting things to see here, and I'll point those out for you as we go along, and then hopefully you'll understand what we're looking at. In general, soils are formed in place, and what's going on is you have things going into the soil, things going out of the soil, things moving around in the soil, or things being transformed in the soil. And so through those processes you start to get horizons. And then there's different factors that affect how much of those processes are being promoted and where others are not. So we have climate, we have parent material, we have organisms or biotic life forms, we have topography, where you are in the slope, and we have how long things have been going on, so for time. So as a pedologist, what you do is you look at the profile and you try and figure out what's going on based on the horizons you see. It's kind of like the last chapter of a book. This is the conclusion, and you got to write the plot. How did it get here logically? And then interpret that for your land use. So that you can get a lot of information from a soil profile. So we'll start off with some of the obvious stuff here. It's very red. This parent material is very red. That means there's a lot of iron oxide already in this parent material, and it's going to affect the color and the fertility, potential fertility. You'll see that there's some different colors happening down here. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But we'll start at the very top. We usually have what we call A, B, and C horizons, and then we add little letters after them to symbolize what is the main process going on. So this is all dark here, much darker than the red material down here. And what makes that dark is organic matter. So how did that organic matter get into this part of the soil? Well, from here, it's a land use decision. It was a human-caused mixing of organic matter down to about here. You can see that it's quite a bit darker than the rest. And then up here, we also have it even slightly more dark and what we call more friable, easily broken, nice granular structure, whereas here it's a lot flatter. Structure's different, friable still, but you can see the color difference there, slight difference here. So there's two episodes of organic enrichment or current activity there. One goes to about here, and then the other to about here. So, because this is human caused by tillage or pasture, we call this an AP, little p standing for plow layer. This one is more active than this one. This is from tillage, and this is from active pasture root sloughing from the grasses. So AP1, AP2. Then what's happening below this? Well, before this was organically enriched, it would have been leached, because this would have been forest cover here before the active farming. And so we would have had movement of iron down into the profile from the leached layer, because in Nova Scotia we have a lot more water going through our soils than we have coming up. And that's a climate impact, or a climate effect. So we have a lot more water going through our system through precipitation, snow melt, and that water is going to carry stuff down. And in some cases it gets concentrated further down in the horizon or in the profile. In other cases it runs right out of the system. So this area here is a little bit redder than this area here. It's subtle, and sometimes that's the case. That's a parent material influence again. Very subtle changes between these two horizons, but it's there. And if you use a color chart, like one of these Munsell color charts, you'd be able to quantify that color as being different than that. So I'm going to put the pegs here to mark this horizon and this horizon. We're calling this a BF1 because now we're into the B horizon, and the little f stands for ferric or ferrous iron enrichment here, and a BF2. Now where this pit really gets interesting is this part below that. Right at the very bottom, right here, you can see I can take a slice out of that quite easily, and it's very smooth, massive, high in clay, very high in clay, and water will not go through this very quickly at all. So when water is in the system, especially after spring snow melt, water will come down to this layer here and basically just stay there for weeks at a time, maybe even months. And because of that, air is getting knocked out of the system, and we have what we call anaerobic conditions. And so the iron and the manganese are going to react chemically, and you're going to get movement of soluble manganese and iron. And it's going to move across this area here because it can't move into this, it's too massive. And so the iron and manganese is kind of moving around in solution. And then air gets back into the system after water eventually gets evapotranspired, or some of it drains in the summer. And then all that manganese and iron reoxidizes into these splotches. So what we have is here is a manganese model, this black area, and where you see all the kind of light shades of reddish or whitish color and various shades of red, that's the iron influence being concentrated. So all of this area here is partially formed through anaerobic conditions or glaying conditions. And so that becomes a horizon that's influenced by that condition, those anaerobic conditions, and we have a letter we use for that called G for glaying. However, it's not constant, it's not all the time, so we added another letter after that called a J, meaning it's partially expressed. And so we have what we call here a BCGJ horizon. And that goes to about, well, actually all the way down, I would say, to here. And another interesting feature of this profile is this big gray band here. This is practically all sand, 100% sand. Medium size. How did sand get on top of clay? The only way that works is this is a different deposit than this. So this would have been laid down much earlier in time than this deposit. And when this deposit was laid down, it was also water worked by the glaciers, meltwater somewhat. And so you had some sorting. Not everywhere, because it's discontinuous. You can see it stops right around here, continues on here. So when this glacial till was deposited, there was a little bit of water working, sorting of the sand, and you have a lens or a layer of sand here as part of this deposit. And that makes it easier for the water to move around here as well, when it's sitting on top of this impervious clay. So an interesting feature of this profile. So then we get to the very bottom, and that's a second parent material. Different from this, totally different. But how it affects the soil formation here is this keeps water from flowing down, and water stays here and does all this effect on the soil, as I mentioned already. So when we're in a little depression like we are here, the water will gather and sit there. If we're on an upper slope position, the water would just run down slope through this porous, sandier material running on top of this. So topography has a big effect on where the water goes and how it flows. And if you're in a lower slope position or flat area, the water will stay there. If you're upper slope, it'll move down. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different horizons in this profile. And based on what we see here, we can interpret this soil for various land uses. In Colchester County, where we're located, this is not a bad soil for agriculture. It's reasonably friable up here, sandy loam. So it doesn't hold on to water too bad, but it doesn't lose it too quickly either. We have organic matter enrichment. That helps, although it's artificial, it helps the fertility. Because the parent material is very much derived from red sandstone in the till, the natural fertility is low. So in order for this to be a agricultural soil, you have to add fertilizer and lime. But that's pretty common in Nova Scotia. Naturally, this would be a forest soil. Drainage-wise, it's about moderately well to imperfect, depending on the thickness of where this starts to come in. Land use-wise, for other things like sewer or for septic, all these can be interpreted based on knowing what this profile looks like, the texture, the depth to impermeable layer, the drainage condition, how well water moves up and through the system. All that can be derived and looked up into different conditions that suit different land use. So overall, a very interesting profile. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about what's going on here with all this redox feature we talked about. It's an important component of soil development quite often, and it's also very much related to what happens in wetlands. Now, in most soils in this part of the world, as over most parts of the world actually, the color that you see in the soil is coming mainly from a few constituents. And in this soil, iron oxide is the main paint on the soil. You can see that this is what just normal quartz would look like, kind of grayish. But when it has an iron oxide paint on it, it turns it kind of reddish. Various shades of red and orange from the different iron oxide minerals. Organic matter also adds color to the soil, as we saw up here. Iron oxide paint, sometimes manganese, organic matter, those are the main things that give color to soil. Under reducing conditions, when the oxygen is out of the system, because of high water content, what will happen is the iron gets transformed from an oxide, Fe3+, to a reduced form, Fe2+. And that's related to microbes doing some redox reactions with other compounds other than oxygen. And we'll get, you can get into that on your own a little bit. Also what happens is manganese will get chemically reduced from 4+ to 2+. And when those things happen, the iron that's normally in the manganese that's normally not soluble in water, in their reduced forms they become soluble. And so then they're freely able to move, diffuse in all directions, as opposed to being paint on the wall. It's like putting paint thinner on your wall. It dissolves the paint and the paint can move anywhere. And while that condition is still in place, it'll diffuse all over the place. And then when air gets back into the system, Sometimes you'll have areas of the manganese and the iron where you've had the iron move, or the materials move out and concentrate in other areas, and other areas where it's been depleted. And when the air gets back into the soil and reoxidizes those compounds, you'll see the difference in color. So here is where some of the manganese was concentrated. So when it reoxidized, you can see that it's quite dark compared to what it normally would look like. For the iron, it's even more noticeable. You get these areas that are kind of lighter colored. That's because more of the paint was removed and concentrated further away, like over here. So you have concentrations and depletions from the iron, and the only way the iron will do that, show that kind of feature, is if it had to been chemically reduced, made soluble, moved around, and then reoxidized in place to show the different shades of the iron oxide paint. And that's a telltale sign of the drainage condition without there having to be water in the soil at all at the time you can look at it. So you can tell this in the dead of summer or in early spring, because this is a long-term process. It takes many years for this to develop. So it means it's a regular occurring drainage problem to this level. Because if it was any higher than that, we would see the same features further up. So this says that seasonally the water table is saturated, or the soil is saturated to about this level most years for several weeks of the year, usually after spring snowmelt. And again, it's not able to go away because of our topographic position, and also because it can't go down further through the clay. So it sits there until it evapotranspires further into the summer. So you can see there are clearly some different colors of the soils in this profile, and that's pretty common within a soil profile to see different colors. And there is a way to quantify those colors, not just say that it's brown or it's red or it's whitish gray. So in order for someone in Australia to know exactly what I'm referring to, and I know what they're referring to when they color a soil, we use what's called a Munsell soil color chart, and this allows you to quantify the color, not just describe it. So the way this works is they have different color chips in this book that have been found to be the ones that cover all the range of soil colors you'll ever find. And they quantified by the hue, the value or lightness, the chroma or the kind of the strength of the color. And you can use not only this book to quantify the color, but also to help interpret what's going on in the soil for different processes by the color that you find. So clearly this soil here is a lot darker, so it would be a lower in value. The higher in value, the lighter the soil. So when you see a low value soil like that, it usually means there's organic matter enrichment. Now here's a red soil as we talked about, and this one is a sandy soil that's quite whitish. So this would have a high value. It would be on the lighter side of the charts. So what you do is you find a soil chart or a hue chart that looks similar to the color that you're wanting to try and match. And it starts off red on one side and gradually gets more yellow as you keep turning the pages. And that's what the 10 or the YR stands for up in the top corner. Y stands for yellow, R stands for red. So the book starts off with essentially all red soil. And 10R, which is very red, hardly any yellow, and then keeps going across, gradually get into 2.5 YR, 5 YR, 7.5 YR, 10 YR, and then you lose the R altogether, and now you're into the more yellowish and olive colors. And every color that you've seen, that you can see in here, I've found in soils in Nova Scotia, so there's quite a range out there. But this soil looks to be more in the 2.5 YR, the reddish side. So I start off there and I put a nice clean face of the soil. I don't want to smudge it with my hand. And I lift up the chart and I try to find the chip that matches it. and I just go underneath until I find one that looks pretty close. Sometimes you can't match it exactly, but then you just get the closest one. And to me, this looks like 2.5 YR 4/6 red. What a surprise. It is red. But the most important part is the 2.5 YR 4/6. That way somebody in Australia knows exactly what color I'm talking about. And they can relate that to their own knowledge of their own soils. So that's how you use the Munsell color chart to color soils. Okay, another important component of soils, or a feature of soils, is the texture of the soil. And texture is defined essentially as the percentage of sand, silt, and clay in a soil. Sand is anything less than 2 millimeters. So anything that's greater than 2 millimeters in size is considered a coarse fragment, or starting with gravel, moving all the way up to boulders. But anything less than 2 millimeters in size is part of the texture determination. Sand is the coarsest, silt is in the middle, and clay is the finest. And the proportions of each have an influence on the moisture and the nutrient retention capability of the soil, the CEC, various things like that. So it's important to have that. It's a fundamental characteristic of the soil. You can analyze it in a lab and get exact measurements, but when you're in the field you can estimate it fairly accurately using different tests. The test that I like to use is called a field test, F-E-E-L. And what you do is you rub it and play with the soil in your fingers, and you can figure out how much sand and clay are in it. And then by default, the rest of it is silt. So the way that works is you take some sand, some soil in your hand, roughly that amount. And right now, if I turn that over, it's all going to fall off. So it's not moist enough to do this test. So you usually have to wet it down a little bit. Normally in the field, when you don't want to carry a lot of gear with you, you would just spit on this and it would give you the right amount of moisture. But here I'm lucky to have a water bottle, so I can use that. So I just get it moist enough so when I turn my hand upside down, no soil or water falls off. And that's the right moisture that you want in your soil. So now I'm going to rub this soil between my fingers and my thumb. I don't use my other hand to do this because it's not as sensitive as using the same hand. So I rub this between my thumb and my fingers, and I'm trying to feel the grit. No matter how fine a grit I feel, it is sand. Just like grades of sandpaper at the hardware store, all sizes of grit is part of the sand component, as long as it's under 2 millimeters. So I'm rubbing that and I'm saying to myself, okay, what percentage of that is sand or grit, and what percent of it is smooth, which is the other constituents. And I've calibrated myself to know what different levels of grit feel like. So when I'm rubbing this, I can feel that that's around 60% grit in this sample here. So 60% sand roughly. So now I gather up the material and then I lift my thumb up and down slowly, and I'm trying to feel the stick. Clay is the only thing that makes soil sticky. Silt is smooth like grease or flour, but clay is sticky. And when you have it at the right moisture content, you can feel the stick if clay is there. So what I'm feeling here is what's called slightly sticky. I feel some resistance when I lift up my thumb, but not a lot. So that tells me there's roughly 10% clay in that sample, just by how much resistance I'm feeling on that. So what we have here is a sandy loam soil, roughly 60% sand, 10% clay, and 30% silt, thereabouts. So you can classify that as a sandy loam in your field sheet and move on to the next horizon. Okay, we'll go on to the next one here. And this was that water-worked sandy section that was at the very bottom. And this is clearly, even without any training, you can tell that this is mainly sand. There is absolutely no smoothness in this material. When I'm rubbing it against my fingers, even when it's moist, I'm not seeing any staining on my fingers. It's clear. So that tells me it's almost pure sand. If I had staining on my fingers, that would be the sand or the silt and clay component staining my fingers. So this has got to be at least 95% sand on this one. And clearly a different texture than that. That's an easy one. Now we move on to this bottom layer, the one that was massive and impervious to water or very slow permeability. And you can see that even from the use of the soil knife, I can get a sheen on that soil. When you get that type of shine from using a blade or a shovel, that tells you that there's a fair amount of clay in it because the clay particles have been oriented by the use of that force, and now it reflects the light. So already I know that there's a fair amount of clay in this. So I'm trying to wet it, and clay will absorb water a lot more than other texture components, so you might have to wet this down quite a bit. So I'm rubbing that now, and clearly there's no problem with the moisture content. And I'm rubbing this, and I feel almost no grit whatsoever. Even when I rub it really hard and get a very fine film between my fingers, I'm not feeling any grit. So the sand content in this soil, or this horizon, is almost nil. When you get calibrated, you can really get fairly accurate with this assessment technique. You can easily get within 5%, and often people will get 2% or so difference from what a lab would get you. So it can be a very accurate test once you're calibrated. So I'm rubbing this, and I'm feeling probably no more than 5% sand in that sample. Very plastic, very moldable. So now I'm going to lift it up and down, and the stick, you can see the whole thing is sticking to my thumb. And it's also absorbing more water, there's so much clay there. So when I lift that up and down, that is very sticky. And greasy as well. The grease part is the silt, the stick is the clay. So based on that resistance and based on my calibration, that is probably about, I would say, 40% clay in that sample. And if it's only 5% sand, that means there's about 55% silt. So this is a silty clay loam to a silty clay. That was a sand, and this is a sandy loam. If you look at those on the texture triangle, you'll see there's quite a range in values there.